We'll see who trickles in here. Oh, I got to change this. Hold on. Okay. Okay, how's everybody doing today? Good. All right. Let's we've been talking about the human condition as we actually experience it. Generally, what we've been talking about is what I'll call the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's what we've been going over now for many, many months, talking about first our mutual obligations to one another, to God, and then the relationship of God to the creation and the nature of the creation. And all of this was according to the way God actually set things out. So we could talk about the order of creation, the way God created things to work. Now we've moved into the fall and its consequences, so now we're getting more into the world the way it actually is rather than the world the way it was supposed to be. And so a number of things are introduced into our lives here, such as we talked about last week, aging, illness, and death, our mortality, the shortness of the human life, and that we are bounded. Much came before us, much will come after us, much goes on around us, and we are small and we are weak, and that is part of what it means to be a human being in this world. We are not masters of our destinies. We are actually quite fragile, and our ability to experience what's out there is very, very limited. It's always surprised me how much people claim to know, modern human beings claim to know, when our ability to sample actually the creation in which we live, both in terms of the spatial, the percentage of the universe that we are actually able directly to look at and experiment with and poke around in is infinitesimally small. And the amount of time that human beings have been here to actually look and observe is very, very tiny compared to what's there. This requires human beings, if we're going to draw some vast conclusions about what the other side of the universe looks like or what things looked like 15 billion years ago, let's say we have to do a lot of extrapolating, okay? That requires a lot of assumptions, and the truth is that we really can't do that with any kind of certainty. So human beings live in a situation of being very, very much boxed in. We talked about metaphysical blindness. What I mean by that is, if left only to our experience, if left only to our observations, if left only to logic, in other words, if we have no help from God, then we cannot have any certainty about the way things really are out there. We cannot know with any certainty where we came from, why we're here, what it means, or where we're going. We can guess at it. We can develop different ideas and theories about it, but we can never say, this we know. It's actually amazing how little we can say we know if we're left only to our experiences and logic. If you've ever studied much philosophy, and I don't just necessarily mean modern philosophy, but I mean if you've studied much philosophy, you realize that the study of philosophy is overwhelmingly questions and very few answers. And we Christians should acknowledge that right away. I mean, the truth of the matter is we don't know unless God has spoken. So bear that in mind next time somebody tells you or criticizes you because you can't know that there's a God. And we say, well, Okay, but you can't know anything, so why should I be listening to you tell me what I can't know? I mean, yes, that's true. We are more than willing to admit that if God has not spoken, then we don't know any more than you do. Problem is, you don't know anything either, okay? So, but if God has spoken, then it is possible for human beings to know things that would otherwise be impossible. Well, that's what we're in the business. That's why there is this kingdom of God, because God has spoken and God has acted, and therefore Christians are not in the same metaphysically blind boat as everybody else is, because somebody with eyes has spoken to us, okay? That makes all the difference. Here is another reality of life in this sinful world. And I'll just say it's idolatry. Human beings were created not to be independent, not to have an independent life of our own. We were not designed that way. We do not work that way. If then we abandon the God who created us, we cannot survive unless our hearts fix itself on another God. So we are going to have something that we're going to follow. We don't have any choice. So human beings who deny the one true God are simply doomed to follow other gods, less worthy gods, but that will be the case. When you look at our modern world today, you might be tempted to say that, our modern world doesn't need God. It's an atheistic world. But that would be to misunderstand altogether modern thought. Modern thought refuses to say God and refuses to say that we... But what would you say that modern thought, modern culture has made a God of? Science has made... Nature... I mean, think of what science, what we are taught. Nature is just this self-existing, self-actualizing thing. It just is. It is, it was, and it always will be, okay? What does that sound like? It exists in and of itself. Well, the Christian says there's only one thing that exists in and of itself. That's God. So if you want to say nature exists in and of itself, then if that's not your God, I don't know what is. And where does modern thought look for its solutions? It looks to nature because that's the only reality out there. And science is the tool that it uses to try to draw out of nature the answers, okay? Well, you may say it's a poor substitute for the Christian faith, and I'll agree it's a poor substitute, but it is a substitute, okay? It is where the so-called atheist puts their faith and hope. Now, of course, most people are not atheists, but they're not Christians either. So what is God for most people? I mean, it's kind of interesting, actually, because people are all over the map on this. I mean, practically speaking, what do most people live for? Yeah, I mean, a good time. Try. Yeah, so some people have a little bit more. Not everything that people live for is as ugly and debased as other things that people live for. So some people do rise higher than that. And so they will live for family or for children or to try to do something great and noble for their neighbors or whatnot like that. And of course, we can say kudos to that. You're doing the best you can given the darkness in which you live. That becomes their purpose, their reason for being. It's the God that they serve. When we Christians think of God, we're thinking of a personal God, but people's God may not be personal at all, and it may just be, I am trying to self-actualize, I am trying to do something that makes me feel like there's something bigger out there, or I'm just trying to be happy. So I do what's pleasurable. A lot of people simply equate happiness and pleasure. So if you want to be happy, then do things that are pleasurable and stay away from pain. It's a pretty simple formula in life. It doesn't produce very much, but nevertheless, that's, if you don't have a real God, then you're going to have some other kind of God, some guiding, because human beings are not designed to just be self-sufficient. We don't exist in and of ourselves. We are not masters of our own destiny. We are not creators of our own reality. That's just the fact of it. So life in this fallen world means idolatry is all around. Yes?
Getting back to the nature and science, it seems to me that the people on that side that believe that nature is God and that's pure and holy and self-actualized, that the human is the pollution.
Right. The cancer.
Instead of the human, mankind, God being, us being created in God's own image, us being at the top of the food chain, if you will, the science, nature crowd puts us at the very bottom of the food chain.
So think about that. It's a good point. And so think about the different cosmologies, I guess we could say. For the Christian, human beings are not at the top. What's at the top? God is at the top, okay? God is the creator of all things. Of the stuff that he created, what's at the top? Okay? So we are at the pinnacle of God's creation, and then the rest of creation in some fashion or form exists in order to serve God's purposes, which ultimately feed into... So the universe that God has created was designed to help and support human beings, okay? So we see a very human-centric understanding of God's creation, but when you step back, you say, actually, it's not human-centric, it's God-centric when you look at the whole thing. If you just focus on what God created, then you'd say, okay, human beings then are the apple of God's eye. So that's how Christians would look at it. When you look at the naturalistic, atheistic point of view, then what is the center of all things? Well, what they would say is nature is the only thing that is there. Okay? So that's the thing.
There's no center.
Pardon?
There's no center.
Well, there's not a center in that sense, except that if we're going to talk about reality, this is the only thing there is to talk about. Okay? Now, nature has created things, if we want to put it that way, and one of the things it's created is human beings. Now, how do naturalists speak of human beings?
Just another random accident.
A random accident, utterly ordinary. There we are in no sense the center geographically or geometrically of anything. In terms of importance, there is nothing unusual about human beings. In fact, I mean, then they'll do two interesting things here. Number one is they will look at all the animal world and they will discover, and you watch them do this, how every human attribute will find in some degree or another in other animals. And the reason why they'll say that is not to wow you about other animals, but to get you to understand how unexceptional you and I are. Now, of course, this is funny, because you can find out that, yes, dolphins do this, and then chimpanzees do that, and ants do this, and birds do that, and each of these things have their parallels with humanity. But, I mean, talk about missing the forest for the trees if you cannot step back and say, one of these creatures is not like the others. Human beings are utterly unlike all other creatures, even if we can find parallels to just about everything that we do, if you just look at it very narrowly. Of course, if you look at it somewhat broader, then you'll find no parallels to what we're doing right now, which is such an ordinary thing.
Which animal rights?
Well, I'm talking to you, you're listening to me, we're going back and forth. This is so ordinary for human beings to do. It is unknown in the rest of the animal world. I mean, utterly unknown. It's not like they even sort of, like ants sometimes have some kind of a conversation. There's no conversation there, okay? There might be communication among whales in a very, okay, there's danger, okay, there's fish, okay, it may be that. But there's no such thing as a conversation, whale minds meeting one another. That doesn't happen. So one thing that they do is to stress that we are just a part of all of the other animals out there, and we're just a peculiar combination of these things, nothing extraordinary about it. And of course, once again, I have to stress that this is, you got to have to blush when you say that, because, I mean, just open your eyes, and this clearly is not true. But what they will do is they will dazzle you with constantly focusing on very, very narrow things, and they won't just back up and say, oh, by the way, here's the list of things that human beings do that are utterly unknown anywhere else.
Did you happen to hear that snippet from the Congress people in North Carolina passed some kind of a bill here this last week about something about people have more rights than animals or some crazy thing? I didn't hear what it was.
People have more rights than animals? They actually passed a law that way?
Yeah.
They had to, because otherwise you have these challenges like the elephant that was given human rights.
Yes. This is what happens, by the way. No extra charge on this. This is what happens when you deny what has been always known as natural law, okay? Natural law means that there are certain things that are just obviously intuitively true. They are sort of written into the nature of things, and therefore they are so. As opposed to what's called positive law. Positive law are things we actually enact, okay? Positive law, if you reduce all of humanity to positive law, if all law has to be positive law, then somewhere you have to have some law that says, by the way, human beings have more rights than animals. If you don't, if you can rely any on natural law, that is not a law you need to pass, okay? It is obviously true. So one way is that human beings are utterly unexceptional from other animals. The other way is much more fantastic yet. This is fantastic enough to assert that human beings really are not unique at all. The other way is even more fantastic, and that is the assumption that our universe is filled with other intelligent beings, other civilizations, far more advanced than we are. They would put us to shame if we could see ourselves through their eyes. We would realize how lowly and backward and violent and ugly we are. And the universe, and how do they know this? They know this by sheer mathematics. They have two assumptions. Number one is we have arrived by natural means. So there's nothing special about our Earth that caused us to arrive. And sheer mathematics will tell you that if we arrived here by the natural operations of the universe, there are a number of other planets, if you just grind through the mathematics, that would be close enough to our Earth to support life to our X zillion numbers, and then just a certain percentage of these are going to produce, life, and a certain number of those are going to produce intelligent life, and blah, 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 and you just churn through the numbers, and you can come up with almost any number you like. The universe is filled with all of these other civilizations. How many times have you heard it said that this is, scientists will be asked, do you believe that there's other intelligent life? And almost always they will answer, oh, yes. And if they're asked, why do you believe that? And they will say, well, it just has to be. Well, it does just have to be. If we're here by accident of nature, it would be silly to assume that nothing like this happened anywhere else. Of course, if we're not here by accident of nature, then it would be silly to think that it did happen anywhere else. Now, what's fantastic about this is that there's zero evidence for this. I mean, we haven't detected anything in the rest of the universe suggesting that there is any intelligent life out there. Now, of course, hope springs eternal, so they continue to look, and one of these days, everybody assumed this is part of the mythology, and it is really mythology. The day we make contact with another, and there's lots of movies and books and science fiction really revels in this, about what that will be like. And of course, this is just part of the mythology of the modern mindset, that we are utterly unexceptional. We are spit up by the universe as a natural product of the universe, and the universe being the size and scope that it is, certainly we can't be the only time that this has happened. If it is the only time that this has happened, that should cause you to question whether this is an accident. This, by the way, is some of the logic behind what's called intelligent design. The idea that the universe seems to have been designed for us to be here. And of course, that is a subjective judgment, but I mean, it just looks that way. A variety of parameters that have to be just very, very precisely tuned. It's called the fine-tuning argument oftentimes. It had to be just this way. If it weren't just this way, then intelligent life could never have occurred. It's not just intelligent life, it's any kind of life could not have occurred. And so the vast number of sort of universal constants that had to be almost exactly what they are for life to exist, we could say the inference to the best explanation of that is it's not an accident. Okay.
We wouldn't know it if it didn't.
Well, of course, that's the counter argument is if it didn't happen, we wouldn't be here talking about it, which is it's a tautology. Okay. So it's always true. That's, by the way, the same way that they come up with the fact that the universe spit up. I mean, the universe had to have spit us up somehow. We may not know how, but we know that it did. How come? Because we're here talking about it. Otherwise, it couldn't have. I mean, if it didn't, then we wouldn't be here. So, look, it's really very simple. If there's no God, then evolution of some sort had to happen. Okay? The exact mechanism we may not know or understand, or we may figure it out eventually. But either there's a God who created, or the natural universe created us in a natural way, and there's only so many ways that can happen. So if you discount the possibility of God, all you're left with, which is why, this is why you have such a butting of heads between Christianity and science. It's not really, people will characterize it as a conflict between science and religion. That's not what it is. The conflict is between two different religious understandings of the nature of reality. One that says that there's a God, and that explains why anything is here, including us. And the other says there is no God, and therefore everything must have happened in a natural way. That's where the conflict is. But it's not like if you go out and do experiments, you'll find out that actually it all happened by accident. No, there's no experiment to find that out. That is something you assume. You assume that that's the case, and then you read all the data according to that. If you assume that God created, then you read all the data according to that. And that's the conflict. It is a religious or metaphysical conflict. It is not a conflict over data. Okay? It's just, that's not it. And that's what people want to characterize as though Christians want to believe that God created, but now we can see that that is not the case because we can examine the universe and we can see that it is not created. People will tell you that we now know how life originated, so we don't need God to explain that anymore. That's just a flat lie. Well, either that, I mean, the person may not be lying, they may really believe it. It is demonstrably untrue. We have no idea how life started. Okay, now, I'm not talking about how life evolved, okay? I'm talking about how it started to begin with. There is no understanding of this. And any scientist who's at all honest and understands will freely admit we have no idea how this began. We assume that there's something that happened, and if you're an atheist, you assume that that's not God. But they have no clue. Now, as for evolution, I think I mentioned it another time. Evolution is it's a description, but it's not an explanation. It doesn't really tell you how this happened. It's just it's a model meant to try to fit the pieces together as best we can. But a model is not the same as an explanation. This is why it had to be that way. Okay, so we've had many models of the atom, and models of the atom attempt to explain as best they can how this thing works, or what it would look like if we could talk about it looking like something. These models are meant to give us some idea of how these things, but it doesn't explain why it is this way. Why there are these protons and neutrons and other things with it. It doesn't explain why. It just describes what, okay? There is no explanation for why. This goes back to this metaphysical darkness that I was talking about. There is no understanding of why. We just have to deal with what is. And the idolatry idea is modern human beings are fixated on the physical realities of things and logic. So rationalism and empiricism and experimentation and so forth have become what human beings are all about. That's become our God, our official God. Individuals have different kinds of gods that they pursue. Okay? We know, of course, as Christians, that God is an altogether different thing. And we know this not by experimentation, and don't pretend ever to know this by experimentation, but because God has spoken. Okay? So our world is filled with idolatry. People are going to be attached to things. They are not indifferent about it, and they read their entire universe through these ideas of whatever their God or gods are. And that is a reality of life in this fallen world. It was not meant to be that way. Human beings were meant to derive their life, their meaning, and their purpose from the God who created them. But since we have withdrawn from God and He has somewhat withdrawn from us, this is the world that we live in now. It is a religious chaos. Here's a fancy Latin expression. It means to be curved in on oneself. This is a fancy way of saying that we're all very selfish. Now, I don't like using the word selfish because when we say selfish, we usually have something much meaner and baser in mind. So, it's the child who won't share their toys, that sort of thing, or an adult to do the same thing. But actually, what Christianity teaches about the nature of a human being, it does teach that we are fundamentally very selfish, but it's not meaning necessarily in that base way. Sometimes, yes, people act in very base ways, but it is a much more profound inward turning. So really, in one sense, we can say we all have these gods out there that we attach our hearts to. In another way, we can say, actually, for all of us, we are our own gods, okay? We're just not very good gods. We're not very good at it, so we need help. And so a real God doesn't look for help out there. We do. But the fundamental problem with human beings is we really are turned in on ourselves. Now, one way that you can see this, again, in modern philosophy denies that there's anything out there, sort of objectively true, metaphysically, other than nature. Modern philosophy also acknowledges that human beings don't do very well if you tell them that nothing has any meaning or purpose. We just don't do very well, okay? Like I've said many, many times, squirrels do fine with that being the case, but human beings do not. We need to have some sense that there's some meaning and purpose and reason for why I get up in the morning. Well, if there's nothing objectively out there to give me meaning or purpose, then what are we going to do? And we enter into a broad area of philosophy, what we'll call existentialism. Existentialism really just means that I build my own universe and reality around the fact that I exist and the nature of my own existence. Sort of the ultimate, I think, therefore I am. And so in other words, my universe is within my head, and it is constructed based upon my life experiences. It is uniquely mine. And you have your own unique set of experiences based upon your life and what goes on in your head. And it is just as real for you as mine is for me. And all of this is a way for us to try to make sense of and process why we are here. Now, existentialism is going to argue that there's no real connection between what's my reality in my head and things out there, because there's nothing out there, okay? And so human beings don't live for what's out there. We live for the realities that we create. So values and meaning and purpose are subjectively created by individuals, and that's what keeps us going.
There is no human nature.
There is, right, everything is constructed either socially or by an individual. There is nothing out there that is, okay, this is the template, Okay? Now, Christianity utterly denies this. We say there is a human nature. How do we know that? Because God created human beings, and when he created them to be a particular way. We can say an important aspect of a human being is the image of God. That would be an aspect of human nature. But that's a thing that exists. Even if not a single human being in the world actually matches it, it is a thing that exists because God has created it and meant it to be that way. Well, okay, so going back to the existential, I mean, it's hard to imagine being more curved in on oneself than to believe that all meaning and all purpose, all morality, all religion, all concepts of value are all created within me. It's all subjective. That is exactly what is taught in our modern culture now, which is why, by the way, it's very simple, that's why I can't tell you how to believe. That's why I can't impose my beliefs on you, because my beliefs are only true for me. Your beliefs are only true for you. Now, why do we come to this point? Well, because we all have to have beliefs. How come? Because we're human beings, and human beings just have to. We have to have it like air. It's just, you just take that as a fact. If you're an unbeliever, an atheist, you know that human beings have got to have beliefs. They've got to believe that things matter. We do that. But in fact, nothing does matter. Okay? So you talk about being curved in on yourself. That is a very profound, and by the way, I would say, it is a wonderful insight that modern thinking has come to. They don't recognize that is a brilliant and excellent demonstration of what Christianity has been teaching all along, that human beings are, boxed in a bubble of mortality and weakness and deep limitations and curved in on oneself. But that's exactly what you have when you deny all objective reality, and that everything that is human is now subjective. When I say that, everything that is human, I mean all the stuff that human beings do when my mind deals with your mind, okay? That is uniquely human. No other creatures do that. All of that, none of that has any actual meaning. It's just the meaning you make of it, the meaning I make of it. Okay?
There's no objective truth, is what.
There's no objective truth of that sort. Right. Again, there are different flavors of this, but they all really amount to the same thing. The only thing that is objectively true, and what we mean by objectively true is, it's true for everybody no matter what. Okay? Whether you believe it or not, it's still true. And that would be the properties and operations of nature. Nature is real. So modern thought would not say that nature is a construct of your mind. But the order you see in nature is. Okay? So when you say things like, gee, creation seems to be designed for human beings in life, that you are creating an order. You are seeing something that isn't really there. Kind of like looking at the popcorn ceiling and seeing patterns in there. Or looking at the stars and seeing, lions and various constellations. You are imposing an order that isn't actually there. It's all a trick of your mind. So are things like natural law, God, and good, right and wrong. All of these are illusions. Okay? Tornadoes tearing up cities and killing people may seem bad to you, but that isn't a subjective judgment. It's really not bad, because there isn't any such thing as bad other than in the minds of people. Okay? So human beings are profoundly turned in on themselves. How can they help it if you don't have God? All we have left then is ourselves. So this is another aspect of life in the fallen world. As I said, our modern culture has really put a focus on this, and actually it's not only put a focus on it, but celebrates it. In the past, this was not something that was celebrated. It was something that was known, but it was not celebrated. It was something to be defeated. something as pervasive as suffering. Just human suffering. What was the movie? What was that movie with the Stephen with the tiger and the guy on the Pi, Life of Pi? Interesting movie. I really enjoy the movie. It's not a Christian movie, but it is really quite fascinating. At any rate, he's in the hospital and he's explaining, or I guess he wasn't in the hospital at that time, he was telling a story. This guy was telling a story about a fellow that was with him that was going through some intense suffering before he died. And he was just reflecting on this. And he said, I looked at this man, I watched how he suffered and suffered intensely. I couldn't do anything to help him. And then he died. And he said, and I just couldn't see the point of it. That was sort of the bottom line for him. I couldn't see the point of it. Well, that's an interesting aspect of life in this fallen world. We hear, and Christ will tell us, that our suffering has a point. But there's no way you're going to see that just by observing. We can say that suffering leads to perseverance, okay? And perseverance leads to hope, and hope does not disappoint us because of God's love. We can say that because we've been told that, but we don't observe it necessarily. Is it true, that suffering makes people stronger? Sometimes, and sometimes it destroys them. Okay? Can we see good come out of suffering? Sometimes. Can you imagine? Have you experienced yourself? Have loved ones of your own experienced suffering where you just say, for the life of me, I can't see how this produced anything good? I can think of lots and lots and lots of things. So empirically, objectively, without the help of the Word of God, we have to acknowledge that things happen to human beings all the time that don't seem to have any point, any reason, any purpose. We can't say that suffering correlates to your behavior. If you behave well, you suffer less. That's not always the case. We see oftentimes people will suffer because they deserve it. We will also see many examples of people who suffered who didn't deserve it. We see people who should suffer that aren't. But what we do see is suffering everywhere. There is physical suffering. There is emotional suffering. Mental suffering of all kinds. Human beings are exquisitely designed to suffer because we have so many different levels in which we can suffer. Once again, our poor squirrels basically only suffer in one way. They suffer physically. We suffer physically also. And then we get to worry about it. So this is just such a part of the human condition. We can't imagine life without it, although we want to. It is in no sense what Christ intended. It was in no sense something that God included in the Word, and behold, it was very good. Suffering is not, it is a general thing, we can say. It's a punishment. It's a punishment for withdrawing from God. Maybe a better way to put it would be a consequence. Sometimes punishment is dealt out by God, yes, and for a particular purpose in your life. But an awful lot of suffering just seems to be, it is your misfortune to live in a world like this. Did Jesus suffer? Other than the cross itself, did Jesus get bit by mosquitoes?
Yeah.
Did he get a cold? Did he suffer in other ways? Did he get old? He was 33 when he died, okay? 33-year-olds already have some of the aches and pains of growing older? Yeah, they do. Did Jesus suffer with those things?
Sure he did.
And yet he was not a sinner. So we can't say that there was anything. And you could say, well, but our sin was imputed to him. But that's I mean, the thing is, he came into this dark world and he experienced what it means and is to live in this broken world. Okay? So, yes, when if you pricked him, he would bleed. And he got pricked a lot before he actually died on the cross. He did experience pain. It was an interesting, I mentioned The Chosen several times, and there was an interesting scene where Jesus, had injured himself somehow or another and was having to bandage up his arm. There's nothing in the Bible about this particular thing. It was just a scene that was there. But it was fascinating. I looked at that and I said, yeah, I'm sure that happened. I'm sure that happened. He bangs his arm against something and scrapes it, and now it's bleeding, and now he's got to bandage it up, just like the rest of us. Because that's what it means to be a weak and fragile physical thing in this brutal world. And this is just something we've learned to live with. Here's another thing that we've learned to live with in this fallen world, and that is futility. What does futility mean? It's my garden. Okay?
Sisyphean effort.
There is a picture of futility. And a garden is just a wonderful illustration of so much of life that no matter how hard you work, you're always behind. Okay? And even when you think you've gained a solution, and you may actually get a solution to a problem, watch out, because the solution is going to come with other problems. Okay? Modern life is filled with this. Unintended consequences. We have done so much to knit the world together through telecommunications and computers and all of that. And you'd think that this is 100% positive, only good. How could it be anything else? And we're finding out, it can be a lot of things, and a lot of them are not good. And so we look wistfully, almost wistfully, thinking about, wouldn't it be nice to be Amish for a week, just for a week. And we look wistfully back in the days when things were what? Simpler. Of course, the simpler days weren't all that simple, and I'll tell you what, I don't know who it was that asked me one, it may have been Audrey, asked me, she saw my garden, she said, do I grow that for, to feed myself? And I just laughed. I would be a very, very skinny person. And really, when you actually study how, the pioneers that went west, for example, and how they lived, that's a brutal life. I mean, everything was hard. And when you study the development of the economy in the United States and various inventions that just transformed life. I mean, the ability to weave cloth was an enormous benefit, that you could get huge amounts of cloth with these machines that were running with relatively few people who could just operate those machines. And before that, everything you wore was manufactured by hand at home. And now we just throw out in a year more than most people ever owned in their lifetime, and we think nothing of it. How did we get to this? I was talking about futility. Oh, well, okay, because everything has its consequences. And in some ways, modern life is better, but in other ways, it's worse, because that's the way life is. You're never going to fix it all at once, because of the futility that has been imposed upon this present creation means that we are never going to get a handle on it. Now, whether you recognize this sort of thing or not tells a person a lot about what their ultimate understanding of the nature of the universe is. So if you think that everything is evolving, you may get the imagination that eventually we will get hold of it. Okay? In other words, if you think that society is evolving and that life is evolving and that we are more sophisticated and really we are getting a handle on it, you might entertain certain utopian ideas about how if we can just get the politics right, if we can just get the economic theory right, if we can just get the medicine right, then pandemics and cancer will be a thing of the past, and that hunger and scarcity will be a thing of the past, injustice will be a thing of the past, okay? You can imagine that. But if you are a Christian and believe that God created the world in that condition, but that is no longer the way it is, nor can it be that way, we can't make it that way, then you're going to have a very different understanding of what our job in this world is, okay? We are not, in other words, Christianity is not utopian. You'd think it would be, because we talk about the glorious world to come, and that is very utopian. But that utopia is one that God creates, okay? And so God can do it, but that is not something that you and I expect ever to create, not only on a universal scale, but not even in my own personal life. It's just never going to happen. You know, but that old joke, I finally got it all together, and then I forgot where I put it, or something like that, you know. No, you didn't get it all together, and you may have forgotten where you put it, too. So fighting utility, if you just think of so much of the work that human beings do, is a fighting against the futility of this world, which puts a Christian in a position this way. We do struggle against futility, but we're not fatalistic about it. I mean, think about how heroic it is to be a Christian. Okay? Think about a good archetypical understanding of this would be, think about being a doctor. Now, if you're a doctor, you are dealing with people who are just getting older and older and older and are eventually going to die anyway. I mean, this is always the case. So what are you trying to do then?
Prolong.
Well, or at least try to make for a better quality. You're trying to alleviate suffering. What's the point in alleviating suffering? Something else is just going to come along. Yes, but why do we do it? Well, we do it because, I mean, from a Christian point of view, we do it because that's what Jesus would do. That's what God would do. In other words, God recognizes that our universe has been subjected to futility, but he himself is in the business of alleviating suffering. Now, he'll alleviate it all in the end, but in the meantime, he personally, when his son came into this world, he spent a lot of time alleviating suffering. He calls us to do the same. So at one and the same time, we're fighting battles we know we're never going to win. But we are going to fight. Okay? So we'll gain our little victories here or there because they are good things. So a Christian is not fatalistic, well, we're all going to die, so who cares? Well, we all care. Well, we all have to suffer, so who cares? Well, we all care. And we're going to try. We're going to aim to make life as good as we can, even though we realize that we're never going to arrive, because it is good to try to make things right, even though we can't do it. Think about that. Think about, you know, how much of what we see up there, which is just such a, I mean, these are just a few select areas of human endeavor. All of them involve the futility of this world and trying to beat back the tide. Isn't that what we're doing? Beating back the tide. Why? Because it's good to beat back the tide. But it's futile. You're going to lose. We're going to go down fighting the tide. Okay? Why? Because that's what God would have us do. Not in some insane kind of a way, but because it is a to try to bring God's order into a chaotic world is a statement about the lordship of God in the midst of this chaos. Okay? We're not doing it simply because it makes the quality of life better or just because it makes money. We consider some things to be a positive. Here's somebody suffering. And we don't want them to suffer, even though we know that they're going to die soon. So what do we try to do for them before they die? Alleviate their suffering as much as possible. We may spend time with them. We may talk to them. What a waste. I mean, from a purely economic point of view, this is a total waste of resources. Okay? If you just want to be brutally honest, as an economic matter, it's a waste of resources.
Euthanize them.
That would be a much better, I mean, if you really don't want them to suffer, then euthanize them. They won't suffer. And they won't cost as much money either. But, of course, from a Christian point of view, that's horrific. But from the atheistic point of view, you're just causing people to suffer. Well, okay. But for us, the fact that people are suffering and are going to die does not mean that we euthanize them, because for us, the worst thing in the world is not suffering. It is actually not pointless. None of this is pointless. It may be hopeless chaos in that sense, and it may be a pile of problems we can't fix, but it is a confession of our faith in God that we try. With all our might and main, we try, okay? So human beings in many ways are engaged in heroic, Don Quixote tilting the windmills. I mean, what are you doing here? What's the point of all of this? Well, the point of all of this is when Jesus was here, this is what he did, and therefore this is what we're going to do. So Christians are to be about compassion even when it makes no sense. And everything is not driven by what makes sense and what makes money or what's efficient. Okay? Even though that's kind of what we've made of this world. So Christians should look at these various things up here as not just ways of making money, but as ways of serving our neighbor and ultimately ways of serving God and confessing that God is, in fact, overall, and our ultimate hope is not in succeeding here and now, but it is in Christ our Lord returning and restoring all things. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we know that in the midst of this world we cannot see with our own eyes the point of what happens, because in this world things don't follow logic, and things aren't always good, and things are certainly not the way you made them out to be. But you came into this world, Lord, and you demonstrated before our very eyes how we are to live in a chaotic world such as we live. A world in some ways so far from God. Help us to follow your example, O Lord. To know what we were, to know what we will be, and to struggle here in this present time to do what you would do if you were here. Amen.